this next stop on our journey through Stephen King's short stories being adapted comes from Everything's Eventual again. And it's The Road Virus Heads North, which is one that wasn't always one of my favorites of his short stories. It was one that I had to read a couple of times before I kind of grasped enough what he was going for and was able to appreciate it enough. And of course, it's another one that was adapted for the Nightmares and Dreamscapes miniseries. And about the story itself, it is another one that starts off with a little prologue of sorts of King talking to us as King, as Autopsy Room 4 ended as well, and which is continuous throughout Everything's Eventual. And he talks about that this is actually, like, the painting that he describes in the story is actually one that he owns. And he was inspired to write this story because that picture scared the holy shit out of his kids. And it's always interesting to kind of get that background, because he seems to have a real fascination with the idea where he talks about that, like, the house on Maple Street that's in Nightmares and Dreamscapes, he got the idea for that looking at a picture by Chris Van Allsburg, and then he has a novel called Rose Madder, which is about, like, a picture that changes. And in this one in particular, though, it is interesting how it's kind of like, when you talk about it scared the shit out of his children, you think about the fact that, like, Pet Sematary came from, like, a meltdown that his daughter had about the family cat and stuff like that. And so when you see stuff like that, it almost feels like it comes from, like, a really personal place. And you can see in Pet Sematary how it really feels like it comes from, like, the directions that story goes are so, like, right to the heart in the most twisted way possible, and you can tell it's coming from a really personal and human place and emotion. And this one doesn't quite have that. This one feels more like it was just kind of something for fun. And I get that, but I think the adaptation, when they did the miniseries, kind of tried to add that a little bit. With this whole opening where, the very opening when we see Tom Berenger coming from the editing is so weird, you can't tell if he's coming from the Doctor or going to the Doctor in this moment, but it's basically like they tried to recreate the opening credits sequence of The Sopranos for some reason. Like, I hear the theme song in my head just seeing Tom Berenger drive down the road. And the reason he is either coming to or coming from the Doctor is that he just had his first colonoscopy and they found something. And the story kind of quickly becomes an allegory about him being chased by certain death. Like, death is coming for him in a way. And it's like, alright, I see what they're doing there. And then we get the next scene and we see, once again, if you want to add the personal touch, you can tell in the story, which is translated pretty much verbatim in the miniseries, which is, shock, surprise, it's a Stephen King story, and it's got his favorite protagonist to use, the tortured horror author, which you know, would seem self-indulgent from any other author, but it's the reason we love King as fans, so there's that. And we get stuff like them saying, like, hey, where do you get your ideas, and do you ever scare yourself, and stuff like that. Very similar to another horror author character that shows up in another story, and Everything's Eventual, that was in a movie that we will be talking about soon enough. And if you're familiar enough with the work, you know exactly who that is and what story that is. But in the meantime, we've set up this whole sort of allegory now. The death is coming for him, and it feels unstoppable and a bit uncertain as well, because they still got to do tests on him before they figure out exactly what it is and how bad it is. But he is pessimistic, especially with his family history. So it's coming for him, similar to the way, you know, we see the road virus throughout the story. The only trouble with this is a reveal that kind of comes somewhere in the middle of the miniseries. And that is, he has an actual run-in, or like has a visual of a run-in with the road virus himself, sitting in the passenger seat of the car and having a conversation with him. And he spells out the allegory. He says, I know who you are, you're what's inside me, and you're what I'm afraid of, and stuff like that. And you're afraid, you represent the disease inside me, and it's coming for me. And it's like, oh wow, well, thanks for spelling that out. It kind of worked nice as an allegory there, but alright. And the road virus says, no, and he basically calls out and says him thinking that it's an allegory is just his narcissism at work. Which is an interesting curveball, until he immediately says after that, I'm your fear, that's who I am. And it's like, well, I don't really get what they're going for with that, because it's like, if he had said, he said, you're the disease inside me, and he's like, no, that's your narcissism. But if he had said, are you the fear in me, would that not have also been his narcissism? I don't know. I don't know what they were going for with that, but to kind of, like, I think it seemed like a nice curveball, where it was like, yeah, it almost seems like a painfully obvious allegory, but I feel like it kind of worked, given what the whole setup is. Like, even if it's obvious, it made sense and kind of added a bit of almost a poetic thing to his life and where it was headed, and that, unstoppable direction to, like, that certain destination. But it's the episode is kind of a bit all over the place. I will say, as far as it being adapted to the screen, even if the small screen's still the screen, I think there's the one thing that held me back from being as into the short story as I could have been was, even despite how well King describes things and brings a picture to life, ironically enough, wording it that way, I always had a hard time picturing the picture when I read the story. I don't know if that's just me, but it's almost like it's described too vaguely. And so the thing that excited me the most about the fact that it was adapted to the screen was like, alright, now I can actually see what the fucking thing looks like, and then the image will be much clearer. Which kind of helps when you go back and read the story again. Obviously it helps to have a really clear image in your head of what the picture looks like, but for some reason, before the miniseries, I could not fully get the image in my head. But there it is. So, now, a big problem with the episode is the direction. What I was talking about at the beginning, where it cuts around a lot, and it's trying to be super duper flashy. For some reason, I don't know. Maybe they were going for, like, because they kind of keep talking about the sort of, like in the story, they talk about how the virus in the picture looks like he has, like, a sort of, like he'd have some sort of rock background or something. And I don't know if the director was going for something like that, where it's, like, super flashy and intentionally disorienting and trying to feel like hardcore. But it really just kind of comes off annoying. There's a lot of, like, the camera's shaking and stuff like that, and it's, as I talked about before, that's like the first page in the manual of directing, like, a straight-to-DVD movie. And it's almost never a good thing. I can't think off the top of my head of when it's ever been a good thing. I mean, maybe somebody like Danny Boyle can do flashiness like that, but you can spot from a mile away when it's, an artistic choice that's going to work, and when it's just trying to be flashy for the sake of being flashy, or for the sake of seeming like it's all over the place, but I don't know. And another choice that pretty much takes everything away from, like, it's almost like they added on to the concept so much by making his character potentially terminally ill. But then there was a choice that was made, and I had a feeling. It's like when you think about, before you've seen the episode, when you think about The Bird Virus Heads North being adapted for the screen, it's a change you kind of figure is going to happen, but you really, really hope doesn't. But it does. And it feels like it ruins the whole feel of what the story had going. And that's seeing the major murder. Seeing the murder of the woman at the yard sale, where it's like it's its whole scene. It reminds me of the murder of the mechanic in Children of the Corn, which of course we'll get there eventually. But because the whole thing, the whole freaky concept, is that you should feel like the main character feels like an unseen force is chasing him. So we see most of the story we're pretty much seeing the story through his perspective. So we only learn about the murder when he learns about the murder. And this is so off base that when the news talks about the murder, he doesn't even see it. they're too wrapped up in a subplot now involving his ex, who's only, like, mentioned once in passing in the story. And much like we talked about with Autopsy Room 4, for some reason, they're all about taking these characters and the main character's love life that really aren't that crucial, and trying to stretch the story out to the needed 45 minutes to fill the time slot that this aired under. And and they get really wrapped up in that, a little too much. So the only other character they needed was the aunt, who's played by multiple Oscar nominee Marsha Mason. I don't know where they found her to do this, but there she was. And that's really the only character you need, and the short story showed that. And to build that threat, because that's the thing, is there's the oncoming threat of, is the aunt in danger or not? And then that's the only other thing that's going on. We don't need this other character at all. It feels like the only reason the other character's there is so they can introduce his beloved dog, which is a new addition as far as I remember. And of course the only reason they add a beloved dog is so they can kill it, which is not cool at all. So, so there's that. Add one more body to it, I suppose. So, yeah, that was a huge, huge misstep to play it up like it's practically a slasher thing, by having the murder scene be a whole scene in itself. And like I said, the way it's shot and edited and all that stuff just looks sloppy as hell, and like them trying to be doing all that, and it doesn't work. So, the question remains is, I don't know, because when you think about that, and the whole thing of it's an unseen force, which is obviously going to work wonders in text form, because technically everything's unseen in text form. So a story like this can really, really thrive in a book. So the question is, was it really, really ballsy, or was it really, really stupid to choose this story as one of the adaptations they were going to do for this miniseries? And I want to say there's some risk taken that, could have paid off in a way. Like I said, they clearly had some ideas of how to change it up a little bit, or how to add to it. But they kind of just kept tripping over themselves and fucking up whatever they set up, and definitely fucking up what was already in the story that was working well on its own, just as a story by itself. So, yeah, so I think there might be an adaptation to be made that could be successful with this story, but it was probably one of the ones that was probably best if it had been left alone. But I suppose they tried, but I don't know. Like Behringer's performance is quite good, and he and Marsha Mason's back and forth works really well when you imagine the back and forth between him and the aunt in the story, which we don't get very much of, and it's nice to see more of that in the adaptation. But that's, yeah, for the most part, I feel like another story probably could have been chosen in place of this one to do in the miniseries. So I think that's all I really have to say on this one. The next one is going to be a movie, though it's going to be it was a TV movie made for one of the stories. We're going back to Night Shift. And then we'll go from there, and like I said, we'll continue this alternating of TV episode, movie, and so on. So the very next thing is going to be a Versus, which is going to literally, like, when you're watching this, the Versus is probably already there. So, and then we'll go from there and see what happens. So until the next thing, I think that's it.